Welcome. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a subject that can feel, well, like navigating a legal labyrinth, the world of contracts. For anyone gearing up for something as crucial as the bar exam, the sheer volume and complexity of legal material, especially in contracts, it can be incredibly daunting.
It really can.
But our mission today, your mission, is to cut through that noise. We're here to provide a clear, structured understanding of contract law, acting as sort of your personal shortcut to mastering these essential concepts.
Right.
We'll be using the after mnemonic as our guiding framework for this entire deep dive, breaking down every critical component and helping you build the analytical muscle needed to become a truly insightful lawyer.
That's right. And this deep dive isn't just about, memorizing rules. It's really about understanding the foundational logic of contract law.
Okay.
Correctly identifying how these principles flow and connect is absolutely key to success, particularly on a high-stakes exam like the bar. Our goal is to illuminate not just what the rules are, but crucially, why they matter and how they apply in real-world scenarios. It's about building a solid analytical foundation that will serve you well beyond the exam hall, into your practice.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with our A and after, applicable law. Here's where it gets really interesting right from the start. Common law versus the UCC. Why does this distinction matter so much? It seems like a foundational question that could completely change your approach to a problem.
You've hit the nail on the head. It matters because it dictates the entire set of rules you'll apply to a given contract scenario. It sets the stage for everything that follows, from how a contract is formed to what happens if it's breached.
Right.
The fundamental division is quite clear. First, we have common law. This is your default rule. It applies to contracts primarily for services. Think about hiring a plumber, right? Or an architect, or even an attorney.
Right.
It also governs contracts for real estate like buying or selling a house or land. Basically, unless a specific overriding UCC rule applies, common law is your go-to.
Got it. Default.
Second, we have the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code. This is a statutory body of law specifically designed for contracts involving the sale of goods. And here's a critical point for you. The dollar amount of the sale is irrelevant.
Oh, really? Not just big-ticket items?
Nope. Whether it's a $1 million machinery deal or a $5 coffee maker, if it's a sale of goods, the UCC is usually in play.
So if I'm analyzing a bar exam question, the very first thing I need to do is figure out services, real estate, common law, or goods, UCC. That's like choosing the right playbook for the game.
Precisely. That's often the very first step in your analysis, and it's pivotal. And there's a crucial nuance here, a real bar exam hotspot. You need to pay special attention to UCC rules that apply only to merchants. The UCC, which was really forged in the mid-20th century, was a direct response to these older sort of horse and buggy rules of common law that just weren't practical for fast-paced commercial transactions.
Right, things move faster now.
Exactly. Imagine trying to buy, say, 1,000 microchips. If every single term had to be perfectly mirrored and negotiated individually, it would just grind modern commerce to a halt.
Yeah, impossible.
So the UCC acknowledges that business isn't always done with perfectly negotiated terms, and for those who deal in goods regularly are merchants, it often provides more flexible rules to keep the wheels of commerce turning.
So what is a merchant exactly in this context?
Good question. A merchant is someone who deals in goods of the kind sold, or who holds themselves out as having special knowledge or skill regarding those goods. So, a car dealership, selling cars, merchant. But you selling your old car to a friend, probably not a merchant in that transaction.
Makes sense.
These merchant-specific rules are common areas of distinction on the bar exam, testing your precision and application. Correctly identifying the applicable law sets the stage for everything else that follows: formation, breach, remedies. It's the framework upon which your entire analysis rests.
Excellent. So once we know which set of rules we're playing by common law or UCC, how do we actually make a contract? It all starts with F in after, which is formation. This covers mutual assent, consideration, and defenses. Let's dive into mutual assent first, beginning with the offer. What exactly makes, a casual chat about selling a car suddenly become a legally binding offer?
Right. Mutual assent, often thought of as a meeting of the minds, is truly foundational. Without it, you simply don't have a contract. An offer specifically is an objective manifestation of the offer's willingness to enter into a contract.
Objective manifestation. What does that really mean?
It means what a reasonable person in the offeree's shoes would believe, not necessarily what the offerer was secretly thinking.
Ah,
This objective standard is critical because it then creates the power of acceptance in the offeree. It's all about what's communicated outwardly.
got it.
There are a few key ingredients that, when combined, tell a reasonable person, okay, this person is serious and ready to be bound. First, there must be a present intent to contract.
Present intent.
Yeah, the statement must be reasonably interpretable as an offer, signaling that the offerer actually intends to be bound if the other party accepts. This distinguishes a genuine offer from, say, a mere invitation to negotiate or a preliminary discussion.
Like, I'm thinking about selling versus I offer to sell.
Exactly. I'm thinking of selling my car for $5,000 is probably not an offer, but I offer to sell you my car right now for $5,000. That likely is.
Okay.
Second, the offeree must have knowledge of the offer. You can't accept something you don't know exists.
Right, the classic lost dog reward example.
Perfect example. If someone returns your dog but never knew about the reward, they haven't accepted the offer for that reward. Third, and very important, the essential terms must be certain and definite.
Essential terms. Like what?
Typically, the subject matter, the price, and the quantity. And here's where common law and the UCC diverge a bit. Common law is generally more strict. It usually requires all these terms to be quite definite for an offer to be valid. The UCC, on the other hand, is more flexible, especially regarding price. Price can sometimes be, filled in by market rates or other mechanisms if the parties clearly intended to contract.
But not quantity, usually.
Right. The UCC almost always requires a quantity term for goods. You can't have a contract for some widgets. Needs a number.
Okay.
Finally, the words used must be those of promise, undertaking, or commitment, not just inquiries or invitations. And the offer needs to be targeted to a specific person or a definable group who could actually accept it. It can't just be shouted into the void.
So clarity and commitment are key. Now, what about when an offer ends? Because offers don't last forever, do they? This termination of offer seems like a major trap for the unwary on the bar exam. It's where a lot of students might stumble.
It absolutely is a huge area. Offers can terminate in several ways, and understanding these is critical. First, death or mental incapacity. If either the offerer or the offeree dies or becomes mentally incapacitated before acceptance, the offer terminates. Poof, gone.
Even if the other person doesn't know yet.
Even if the offeree sends an acceptance before learning about it, the power of acceptance simply ceases to exist at that moment.
Wow. Okay.
Second, destruction or illegality. If the subject matter of the offer is destroyed, like that rare painting you offered to sell burns down before acceptance,
Offer's gone.
offer's gone. Or if the performance becomes illegal before acceptance, same result. Third, lapse of time. An offer terminates when it says it does, or if no time is specified, after a reasonable amount of time.
And reasonable depends on.
The circumstances, nature of the contract, industry practice, maybe how urgent it seemed, the means of communication used, it all factors in. Fourth, rejection. If the offeree clearly conveys they don't intend to accept, or takes action inconsistent with accepting.
Like saying no thanks.
Exactly. Or making a counteroffer. A counteroffer is huge. It acts as a rejection and creates a new offer. This is crucial. The original offer is dead. The roles flip.
Okay. Rejection kills it. Got it. What else?
Fifth, express revocation. The offer can revoke the offer at any time before acceptance, even if they promise to keep it open.
Wait, really? Even if they said, I'll keep this offer open for a week, they can still pull it back on day 3.
Generally, yes. That's the default rule under common law. An offer can be freely revoked before acceptance. A revocation is effective when it's communicated to the offeree, and if mailed, when it's received.
That seems counterintuitive. A bit unfair, maybe. How does the law address that unfairness? Or are there exceptions to this free revocability? Because that feels like a common bar exam twist.
It does seem that way sometimes, but you're right, there are very important exceptions. These are called irrevocable offers, and yes, they're frequently tested because of their nuanced nature and the fairness principles they uphold.
Okay, let's hear them. Irrevocable offers.
Let's break these down. 1. UCC firm offer. This is specific to merchants, remember them.
Yep, selling goods.
Right. If a merchant gives a written and signed assurance that an offer to buy or sell goods will remain open, it is irrevocable for the stated time, or a reasonable time if none is stated, but usually capped at 3 months. And the critical part here, no consideration is required.
No payment needed to keep it open.
Nope. That's a huge difference from common law and a big reason why the UCC has this rule. It provides commercial certainty between merchants. 2. Common law option contract. Now, under common law, for an offer to be irrevocable, the offeror must promise to keep the offer open in exchange for consideration.
Ah, so here you need payment or something of value.
Exactly. The offeree provides something of value, even a small amount, to essentially buy the right to keep the offer open for a period. You're buying time to decide. 3. Partial performance for unilateral contracts. Remember, unilateral contracts, acceptance only by complete performance.
Yeah, like finding the lost dog for a reward.
Right. Well, once the offeree begins performance, the offer becomes irrevocable for a reasonable amount of time to allow them to complete it. The offerer can't just pull the rug out from under them once they've started doing the work.
That makes sense.
Fair. And 4, promissory estoppel, sometimes called detrimental reliance. This is a really powerful concept, almost like contract-like.
Contractly.
Yeah, because it lets courts enforce promises without traditional consideration, just to prevent someone from being unfairly strung along. If the offerer could reasonably foresee, the offeree would rely on the offer. And the offeree does reasonably and detrimentally rely on it.
They act on it, change their position.
Exactly. Then the offer can become irrevocable, but only to the extent needed to avoid injustice. And again, crucially, no consideration is required here either. It's about fairness when someone's relied on a promise, even if no formal contract was perfectly formed yet.
Those irrevocable offer exceptions are really critical, especially distinguishing the UCC firm offer from the common law option. Okay, we've covered offers. Let's move to the other side of mutual assent. Acceptance. How does an offeree objectively manifest their willingness to be bound?
Acceptance, just like the offer, requires that objective manifestation. The offeree has to clearly indicate they're bound by the offer's terms, and crucially, they must know about the offer to accept it. Can't accept what you don't know about.
Right.
Regarding the means of acceptance, the general rule is the famous, or maybe infamous, mailbox rule.
Yes, the mailbox rule always causes headaches.
It does. The basic idea is that an acceptance mailed within the allotted response time is effective when sent.
When it's dropped in the mailbox.
Exactly. Not when it's received by the offerer. Unless the offer specifically says otherwise, like acceptance effective upon receipt, this means a contract can technically be formed even before the offerer knows about it.
Which can lead to some weird situations, I bet. But you said it causes headaches. Sounds like there are exceptions or tricky parts.
Oh, absolutely. The mailbox rule is a common source of confusion on exams precisely because of its exceptions and how it interacts with other communications. Let's try to untangle it.
Please do.
Okay, first scenario. If an acceptance is sent before a rejection, the mailbox rule generally applies. Acceptance controls, contract formed on dispatch. The only way around this is if the offerer receives the rejection first and detrimentally relies on that rejection. It's a pretty narrow exception.
So usually acceptance wins if sent first.
Usually. Second scenario. If a rejection is sent before an acceptance, here the mailbox rule does not apply.
Oh, right.
In this case, whichever communication the rejection or the acceptance is first received by the offerer controls the outcome. So you mail a rejection, change your mind, mail an acceptance. It's a race to the offerer's mailbox. Whichever gets there first dictates things.
Okay, that's a huge difference. First received wins if rejection went out first.
Exactly. Third point, and this is a key takeaway, the mailbox rule does not apply to offers and revocations.
On acceptances.
Pretty much. Offers are effective upon receipt by the offeree. Revocations are effective upon receipt by the offeree. So if an acceptance is sent before a revocation is received, the acceptance controls. Contract formed. For offers and revocations, it's all about actual receipt, not when they were sent.
That's a really sharp distinction. Receipt for offers and revocations, dispatch for acceptances, usually.
Got it.
That clears up a lot. What about other ways to accept besides mailing something? Can silence ever count?
Generally, no. Silence is not acceptance. The law usually wants an affirmative act. But like everything in law, there are exceptions.
Of course.
If the offeree has reason to believe silence should count, maybe based on past dealings, or if prior interactions make it reasonable to expect notice if they don't intend to accept, then silence can be acceptance. Think of like a book of the month club, where if you don't send back the rejection card, they send the book and charge you.
Right. Your silence implies consent there.
Exactly. Now, under the UCC, if a buyer asks a seller to ship goods, this invites acceptance either by a promise to ship or by just promptly shipping the goods. Very practical for business.
Okay.
Now here's a tricky point bar examiners love. Shipping non-conforming goods. Let's say you order 100 blue widgets and the seller sends 100 green ones.
That's not what I ordered.
Right. That shipment is generally treated as both an acceptance of your offer and a breach of the contract. Seller accepted your order but broke the promise by sending the wrong stuff.
So they're on the hook immediately.
Usually. Unless the seller seasonably, meaning promptly notifies the buyer that the wrong goods are being sent only as an accommodation.
An accommodation like, we didn't have blue, hope green is okay.
Kind of. If they send that notice, the shipment acts as a counteroffer, not an acceptance and breach. The buyer can then choose, accept the green widgets, accept the counteroffer, or reject them. The seller isn't initially in breach if they properly notified it was an accommodation. It's a subtle but important out for the seller.
Very tricky.
Okay.
Any other ways to accept?
Sure, actions or gestures alone can imply acceptance. This creates an implied-in-fact contract. Remember the barbershop?
Sit in the chair, get a haircut, pay.
Exactly. Your action of sitting in the chair implies acceptance of the offer for a haircut, even if 0 words are exchanged. Your conduct speaks volumes.
This brings us back to the difference between bilateral and unilateral contracts, especially for acceptance. We touched on it with partial performance making unilateral offers irrevocable, but let's expand.
Good idea. A bilateral contract is basically a promise for a promise. I promise to pay you $50 if you promise to mow my lawn.
Okay.
Acceptance here can be a return promise, okay, I promise to mow it, or by starting performance. The moment you start mowing, that's generally treated as an implied promise to finish, and boom, you've accepted.
Got it. Promise or start doing it.
Right. A unilateral contract is different. Promise for an act. I promise to pay you $50 if you actually mow my lawn. Acceptance here requires complete performance of the act.
Only finishing the job counts as acceptance.
Correct. And as we discussed, once you begin performance, the offer usually becomes irrevocable for a reasonable time to let you finish. But acceptance is still only upon full completion. Now, what about notice of acceptance? Does the offeree have to tell the offerer they've accepted?
Good question. Does it differ?
It does. For unilateral contracts, the offeree generally doesn't need to give notice after completing performance unless they have reason to know the offerer wouldn't find out reasonably quickly, or if the offer specifically asked for notice. If notice is needed but not given, the offerer's duty might be discharged.
Okay.
For bilateral contracts, notice of acceptance is required. And remember, the mailbox rule acceptance is often effective when sent. Under the UCC, if acceptance is by starting performance, notice must still be given within a reasonable time, or the offer can lapse.
That clears up a lot. Now, this battle of the forms for additional or different terms, that sounds like a potential minefield. Common law's mirror image rule versus the UCC's flexibility. How does that battle play out?
It is definitely a minefield and a classic bar exam topic. The common law's mirror image rule is simple, maybe too simple. It's rigid. A reply to an offer that contains additional or different terms, even slightly different, is treated as a rejection and a counteroffer.
So any change kills the original offer.
Any change. The acceptance must perfectly mirror the offer. It's an all-or-nothing game under common law.
Okay. Strict. How's the UCC different?
The UCC's Battle of the Forms, that's Section 2207, is designed for the reality of modern business, where companies exchange forms with their own pre-printed terms. It's much more flexible. Let's break it down.
Please.
Scenario 1. If at least one party is a non-merchant, the offer is considered accepted unless the acceptance is expressly made conditional on assent to the new terms. Any additional or different terms in the acceptance are treated merely as proposals for addition to the contract.
So they don't automatically become part of the deal?
Nope. They're just suggestions. The original offer has to agree to them. It keeps the deal alive, even if there are minor differences.
Okay, that seems reasonable. What if both parties are merchants?
Now it gets more complex. This is the real heart of the Battle of the Forms in prime exam territory. If all parties are merchants, again, the offer is accepted unless the acceptance is expressly conditional on assent to the new terms. But what happens to those new terms in the acceptance?
Yeah.
Additional terms covering something not in the original offer, these become part of the contract automatically between merchants, unless one of 3 things happens. The original offer expressly limited acceptance to its own terms. The new terms materially alter the contract, like a significant disclaimer of warranties that would cause surprise or hardship. The offerer objects to the new terms within a reasonable time.
So additional terms sneak in unless blocked.
Between merchants, yes, usually. Now, what about different terms? Terms that directly contradict a term in the offer?
Yeah, like delivery on Tuesday versus delivery on Friday.
Exactly. Here, most courts apply the knockout rule. The conflicting terms cancel each other out. They're knocked out of the contract entirely.
Start gone, just like that.
Gone. It's as if neither term was ever written. The court then patches the holes by inserting default terms from the UCC itself, often called gap fillers.
That knockout rule is fascinating. So if you can't agree on delivery time, the law just says reasonable time and moves on.
Pretty much. The UCC steps in with a reasonable term to fill the gap, ensuring a contract exists where the parties clearly intended one, even if they fumbled the details. It prioritizes making the deal happen in commerce.
It's very pragmatic.
Extremely. Now, one last crucial point on this. If the offer and acceptance are so drastically different that they don't form a contract even under the UCC's flexible rules, but the parties start performing anyway, they start shipping goods, making payments.
Their actions show they think there's a deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In that case, a contract is formed by conduct. The terms of that contract will be the terms on which the parties' writings did agree, plus any necessary gap fillers provided by the UCC. Conduct can save the day.
Fascinating. Okay, we've covered mutual assent in detail. The next big piece of formation is consideration. This is often called the why of the promise, the reason it's legally enforceable. What exactly is this bargain for exchange, and why is it so central?
The bargain for exchange is the absolute heart and soul of consideration. It means there's a legal detriment to the promisee.
Meaning they do something they didn't have to, or give up a right.
Precisely. They do something they weren't legally obligated to do, or they refrain from doing something they had a legal right to do. And crucially, that detriment is bargained for by the promiser. The promise has to induce the detriment, and the detriment has to induce the promise.
Two-way street, a quid pro quo.
Exactly. It's a reciprocal inducement.
Yeah.
Each side is giving something up or doing something because of what the other side promised. That's the bargain. Consideration can take various forms: a return promise, an actual act, refraining from an act.
So it's not necessarily about economic value then. What about the adequacy of consideration? Does the court care if I agree to sell my $1 million house for, say, a peppercorn or $1?
You're exactly right. Courts generally do not question the adequacy of consideration. The law isn't concerned with whether you got a good deal or a bad deal. If you want to sell your house for $1 and it's a genuine bargain for exchange, the court typically won't interfere.
So a peppercorn can be enough.
If it was genuine a bargain for, yes. Consideration doesn't need to have economic value. Even a promise that might be voidable or unenforceable can still technically count as consideration. The focus is squarely on the bargain for exchange element, not the fairness of the exchange itself. However, there are exceptions.
Always exceptions.
Always. Situations where something that looks like consideration might be deemed inadequate, or where pre-existing duties mess things up. Let's look at those. 1. Settlement of a legal claim. A promise not to sue or to release a claim that turns out to be invalid isn't consideration unless the claim was genuinely doubtful, uncertain law or facts, or the person promising believed in good faith it was valid. Prevents nuisance suits just to extract a promise.
Makes sense.
2. The pre-existing duty rule. This is a big one, especially under common law. If you already have a legal duty to do something, promising to do that same thing is not new consideration for a new promise.
Like the house painter example. Already contracted to paint, can't demand more money for the same job.
Exactly. If you're already bound to paint the house for $5,000, promising to paint it again for $6,000 isn't supported by new consideration from you. You're already obligated.
Yeah.
However, courts often find consideration if you promise something additional or different, paint it faster, use special paint, add trim work. That can be new consideration.
Okay, what else?
3. Past consideration. Historically, something done before the promise was made is not valid consideration. Why? Because it wasn't bargained for. The act wasn't induced by the later promise.
Can't bargain for something already done.
Right. Although the modern trend, especially under the material benefit rule, allows enforcement of some promises based on past actions, particularly if a significant benefit was conferred. 4. Illusory promise. This is a promise that doesn't actually commit the promiser to anything.
Like, I'll buy if I feel like it?
Exactly. It's too vague or gives the promiser total discretion. Since they haven't actually bound themselves, there's no detriment, no consideration, and the promise isn't legally binding.
What about those requirements and output contracts? I'll buy all the widgets I need from you, or I'll sell you all the widgets I make. They seem a bit uncertain quantity-wise. Do they have consideration?
Great question, because they do seem uncertain. But yes, requirements and output contracts do generally have consideration. The promiser is suffering a legal detriment.
How so?
In a requirements contract, the buyer gives up the right to buy that product from anyone else. In an output contract, the seller gives up the right to sell their output to anyone else. They've restricted their future freedom of action. That restriction is the detriment, the consideration.
Ah, okay. The exclusivity is the key.
Right, but there's a catch. The quantities bought or sold must be determined in good faith and cannot be unreasonably disproportionate to any stated estimates or prior dealings. You can't suddenly demand 10 times your usual requirement just because the market price spiked, for example.